Fenger High School Principal Liz Dozier is on a mission to give her kids a shot at a better future.
There's a larger ongoing gang conflict within the community, and like the school, we sit like in the middle of this.
Gentlemen, not gonna happen, not today, not today. Keep it moving. Get out of the street, I'm not gonna say it again. Get out of the street. He's headed southbound on 112th and Emeralds. Principal down, and I broke my shoe. Can you send someone for me on 112th and Emerald? I broke my shoes.
An important part of Principal Dozier's job is to keep tabs on gang conflicts and make sure her students are safe at school. By the time a kid gets to high school, his gang affiliation can become his identity, and even a lunchroom fight can turn into a gang war.
Who was the other girl? I need you to go down there and get that.
Principal Dozier and her team have transformed the culture at Fenger High.
Ladies, it's too loud. It's too loud.
There are two kids arguing. Let's figure out what the issue is, because if we don't get to the root of it, it will continue to bubble up until it will explode.
In 2009, Fenger was identified as a failing school that needed to be saved. Principal Dozier was hired and given broad authority over an entirely new team. She also received a 4-year federal grant to help turn the school around.
The climate in the school was just absolutely abysmal. Like massive gang fights in the hallways, 300 arrests that first year.
We had to have literally 2 districts worth of police in the building for us to be able to change classes one day.
It was a scary time in terms of like, what's happened to our children?
Okay, welcome back. I apologize for that, everybody. I don't know what is going on with our sound. Ms. Dozier, I apologize to you as well. I'm very sorry about that confusion to start. But why don't we go ahead and jump right in here, if you don't mind. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, no problem. This is the life that we live. It's our new Zoom life, at least temporarily. So no problem whatsoever. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for welcoming me into your homes and spaces tonight. I'm so glad to be with you virtually. And thank you especially to Stephen for helping coordinate this program. And also just a special thank you to the Kauffman Foundation for their incredible and generous support of the library's educational programming. Really in all of their support in working with our young people and their education. I just firmly believe as an educator, someone who spent, her entire life in education, the work that Kauffman is doing is just so necessary. And especially as I think about the time and space that we're in now. So thank you to Stephen and thank you to Kauffman and thank you to Brianna for playing that clip. I know it didn't work out, but that's okay. We're gonna talk all about Finger and all about the lessons learned there that I really believe can be applied today as we think about what's happening in our educational system in 2021. So this evening, what I really like to do is just share a bit about my own story and how my life experiences and really my assumptions got in the way of change. You saw a little bit of that if you were able to catch it about the challenges that were faced. But I want to talk about that. But ultimately, what I eventually did to push past those barriers in order to enact true change at one school in Chicago, and how our students' wellness overall is not a zero-sum game. And that sounds obvious, but sometimes in decisions that we make can often feel like a zero-sum game, but it's not. So the short snippet that we played, if you were able to catch some of it, really gives a sense of what my former life was like as a principal. And it's from that CNN documentary series called Chicagoland that included a profile of me and of the work and what we were doing at my high school on the south side of Chicago. So when I got there in 2009, Finger High School was all too typical of what we think of when we think of inner city schools. We had, a lot of kids failing, and not just academically, but truly like in their life outcomes. So what I mean by that is like what was happening to kids, either after they graduated or even when they dropped out, like just their life outcomes. We were just failing miserably as a school. And as you saw from that clip, the situation was pretty daunting. And just to give you an idea of what that was like, our graduation rate was about 47%. So if you could imagine 1,400 young people, only 47% of them were graduating. The dropout rate was 20%. I'll let you do the math on that. That's a lot of kids, hundreds of kids per year. And the year I actually got to Finger, there were 300 arrests at the school, actually inside of the school building. I mean, education, I can't even say it was happening because you can clearly see from those numbers, it was anything but. And to address these problems, I drew on some of the teachings of someone who was very influential in my life. Like I think we all do when we come across like daunting situations, we draw on those we've had experience with. And so I drew on this woman. And so I'll show a quick slide of this woman here. So check her out. You can kind of see what she's up to. She's a Catholic nun. But here's the part that's probably not so obvious. She's actually my mom. Okay, I'm gonna let that sink in for a minute and just let you sink in with that. So I'm sure you're curious as to how is that your mom when the woman sitting in front of your screen tonight is a nun. So here's how that went down. My mom was a nun. She was actually a nun for 20 years before she left the convent, but she actually ministered to people who were in prison. And that's how she met my dad. And things went a little bit off script. Eventually my mom left the convent and she married my dad, and the rest is history. It's me. But my mom, I tell you that story because my mom really brought her strict kind of convent training into my home and into our home. And I was raised with a very firm structure. And I think it's only those of us who are raised with a firm structure who really get what that means. And so for those of you who weren't, I'll tell you what that means. It means like, if I ever erred, there was an immediate correction or an immediate consequence, very firm structure. And, I really took that approach when I walked into Fenger High School. I saw, you saw, and I told you about the stats at Fenger, and I took that approach, and I really believe that could turn things around. A strict, a firm structure with order and consequences. And if you err, something will happen as a result. And so I really summoned my inner nun, if you will, and I imposed a number of just rules and regulations to establish order. For example, I brought in this huge whiteboard, those old school like whiteboards on wheels. And, we had kids who were acting up and doing different things. And I found and listed the, top 75 students. And I called them the hot 75. These are the kids who were causing the main issues in the school. I got their names and their photos and their basic information. And, I literally put each of them on these little cards, and I had like a red section, a yellow section of cards, and a green section of cards. And basically, if you were in the red, I was trying to get you up out of the school. Like I was not playing any games. You had to get out of here, and so on and so forth. Like thinking about how I would even work with kids. I mean, it was very punitive in nature. And I put everyone on notice that if you weren't here to learn, you were not going to be at the school. And, looking back, I can see that I wasn't getting to the root of what was causing those 75 young people to act up. And instead, all I was doing was ratcheting up the traumatic intensity. The neighborhood in which my high school was situated was, is still one of the most historically disinvested communities in our city. There's lack of jobs, lack of opportunity, and really the challenges outside of the school were making it very difficult for the kids inside of the building, leading to anger and oftentimes some of the results that I was talking about earlier. It's ironic because even in spite of all this, the community itself and the people were beautiful. It was just incredibly complex. And our kids were carrying, I call them kids, they were high schoolers, but they're kids to me. Our kids were carrying around these invisible backpacks, if you will. And for those kids, like the students at Fenger, they were holding the weight of the world in those backpacks. I mean, every waking hour, many of our kids were carrying around concerns about, what was going on at home, what was happening in the neighborhood, and even if they were going to get home, because it was the streets honestly weren't safe. And I know that might be foreign as I think about the students in Kansas City. They might not be dealing with the same issues as our students at Fenger, but the kids in Kansas City are lugging around their own indivisible backpacks too. They have anxieties, around their families and friends, about classes and COVID, about being accepted, and just honestly just finding their places in the world. And not only have students' lives been upended really by COVID, they're now in the midst of this mental health pandemic, and the uncertainty and loneliness are some of the biggest symptoms of that. But I digress. I'm afraid that when I think about that time at Fenger, the 6 years I was there, that those first couple of years, I was really guilty of not being sensitive to the invisible backpacks that were weighing down our students. And after months and months of utilizing the Hot 75, as well as, there were students that were being arrested and countless other tough on misbehavior tactics, I really had to step back and I had to accept that this whole whiteboard approach, this very punitive approach, wasn't working. And honestly, we were all losing. Our kids were barely surviving, let alone thriving, and something had to change. And the irony in all this, I think about what had to change. I realized that it was me. I had to change. And I needed to accept that I didn't have all the answers, but maybe some of the people around me did. And I had to shift my orientation and the orientation of all the adults in the building to better serve our kids. And so for you all at home, I would just ask you to just think, I wonder how many times in your own lives you've been in similar situations, where you really came in and you thought, I really have all the answers here. Or where you were certain about particular assumptions about someone or something and maybe decided to write that person or that thing off. And, how often have you truly failed to see someone? I mean, similar to my first couple of years at the school, just something to think about. So, I brought a lot of people around the proverbial table. Once I realized I had to change, a ton of maybe unusual suspects, if you will. So, definitely the social workers were there, but, it wasn't just the social workers who came around that proverbial table. It was everyone. It was, from teachers, the gym coach, cafeteria workers, the janitors, all of them, all the people that had different perspectives on kids, different relationships with kids, because each of them had value in how they understood our students and how they had built relationships. And so working together with this team, we ditched that whiteboard and went back to the drawing board. And instead of looking at our students as kids who basically need like more structure and more discipline in their lives, we began to look at them through a different and a more complex and more nuanced lens as young people who were victims of trauma. And this made us really confront a larger underlying issue, which I think is true across our educational system in various contexts. And it's this underlying issue that the overall ecosystem in our kids is challenged, it's broken. So, my initial strategy, disciplining kids with suspensions and expulsions and sending them back out into this world, was actually the worst thing we could have done. And I think we came to realize that we had to transform the school into its own mini kind of microcosm, its own mini ecosystem. And it needed to become a place of sanctuary. And we as a school had to provide not just the physical safety, but emotional safety. And it had to be a refuge where our kids could at least temporarily, shed those really heavy emotional backpacks. And so we had to change the question from, what's wrong with you? Which is a question, if you think about some of the stats I was talking about earlier, it's an easy question to ask. What's wrong with you? We had to change it to what's happened to you. And when you approach it with that second question, what's happened to you, you have to begin to unpack the whole environment and the situation and the reactions and what kids are doing in a different way than what's wrong with you. And so with that question in mind, what's happened to you, we really developed a holistic approach that got rid of the labels on kids and attempted to address the whole child. At the very heart of a healthy social emotional development in a child is, just a positive relationship with an adult. I mean, I think it goes without saying, but, there are studies that have shown that if a child has just one adult relationship in a school, that child is has a measurably higher likelihood of more successful outcomes, everything from grades to attendance. I mean, you name it, like there's measurable success there. So in short, what we're trying to finger was to create a trauma-informed and really a healing environment. And as some of you probably know, the core elements of being trauma-informed are really building a safe community. That's so important, not just safety from the physical standpoint of this, but safety in terms of psychological safety, a place where kids can really be themselves. The other piece of this is build and strengthen relationships amongst their peers in healthy ways, but also with adults in the building. And then really teaching and modeling self-regulation. Those were absolutely critical. And so to achieve these three goals, we did things that were large and small. I mean, we experimented, we took risks, we had plenty of trials. And let me tell you, there were plenty of errors along the way. We did everything from bringing more counselors. When I got there, like I mentioned, we had 1,400 young people and we only had 2 counselors, if you can believe that. And we built this up to 8 counselors while turning a lot of other faculty and staff and just team members into unofficial counselors, if you will. We did things with the school's physical appearance with paint and posters and just touches that show there was care and love in the space. We don't oftentimes talk about love in schools, but that too is like critically important to a child's development. We hired a lot of male teachers. We had teachers go on home visits to better understand what was going on in students' lives. And the process, what we really made was a lot of surprising discoveries because we were open. We really, again, changed that question from what's wrong to you to what's happened to you. For example, I noticed probably around year 2 or so, I was there again for 6 years, but around year 2, every time, there'd be like a holiday, think like, a winter holiday break or a spring break, like right before that, about the week or so before, we'd have all these disruptions, like fights on campus and it just didn't make sense. I mean, I grew up where, right before the winter holiday, everyone's in a great mood because we're getting up out of school, or for spring break, we're all excited. But it wasn't the case at my school. And it wasn't until we began to like question and unpack that as a team that we realized that, for our kids, a lot of our kids, like the vacation actually meant increased stress because there were a lot of other things they were going to have to deal with in their own home environment, in their own community, and they weren't going to have that refuge, that kind of safe space, that sanctuary that we provided at the school. And so, we did small things to help, mitigate some of that, everything from dressing up the school in an air of festivity to, providing different ways to connect while vacation was happening. And we made our kids, feel like they were a part of an extended family, because they were. Everything from, I think about particularly the Christmas holidays, like, having some of our team members dress up as Santa Claus or giving out these little small gifts. It was small things, but all elements of care that acknowledge like the humanness of our children, which sometimes when we think about the environments that I'm describing, we leave that out and we begin to otherize. So those things were important. And it was interesting because once we transformed the school environment and truly the supports within that, we really saw that the young people transformed. They began to lose a lot of that invisible backpack and started being who they really were, which is, incredibly, curious and resilient and just engaged young people. And that is when I really got to see what resilience looks like. As our kids started to blossom before our eyes. And don't get me wrong, it was still complicated, but the complications were different. So it worked out in many ways. And I'll share with you a quick graph that kind of gives you a little bit of an illustration. You can see what happened with those graduation rates and dropout rates. During our team's tenure at Finger, the graduation rates rose from 47% to 80%. That dropout rate fell from 20% to less than 2%. And the annual arrest rates in the school declined from 300 per year, give or take, to less than 10. And, I say all that because the fact is, I think about COVID and I think about the state of the world that we're in. It's brought us really to a unique moment in time that plays to educators' many strengths. It has put public schools at the front, really all schools at the front and center of everyone's mind. And the things that I've heard teachers, parents, and principals do for kids over the last year is nothing but amazing. But, we're on the cusp of the summer. And not only will the coming months bring endless planning for, thinking about school return and thinking about, our children and learning loss, but there's also this unique question of like, how do we ensure that the social emotional needs of our students are met, not just met, but exceeded? And this mental health pandemic is real. And it's not something that we can ignore. There are now added challenges for our young people that they're going to be wrestling with in the wake of this overall experience. I think without question, this last year or so, from a variety of reasons, not just COVID, but a variety of reasons, has been traumatic for many children. And it's been inducing anxiety, from the disruption to the isolation to, just the things they're seeing and learning on the news. There's just a lot. And there's just no simple way to overstate the magnitude of the situation. There was a study that I saw recently, and I can share a really quick slide on that, but it just showed worldwide how there was one point in time where, 90% of, school age children were actually out of school. I think it was something like, 1.6 billion children were out of school. And we know that, it would have required years to adequately plan for a shift like this, but, it's something that happened overnight. And as a result, in a lot of ways across the country, not just in our own cities, but in our country, we've been triaging and managing this tidal wave of a problem, not just from an academic perspective, but from a social emotional perspective. And the net effect has been, we're exacerbating inequities that were already in place and were plaguing our society. And at its very best, online learning can provide an adequate education, but it's worse, there isn't really any education at all. And, everything from not having online access to the variety of, things that are happening in a child's home. And that's a reality for millions of children. And adding to that environment of inequity, has been this sharp spotlight that's been shined on, unequal treatment of, people of color, all the things we saw in 2020 and beyond that everyone has been kind of waking up to. And I think that too has had an effect on our young people, all young people. The world feels, I think for a lot of people, a little less safe than it did. And I know from my experience at Finger, it's very difficult for learning to happen when safety is in place. And again, not just physical safety, but psychological safety. And all of this has a major academic consequences, also major health consequences. There's a study of children who were under lockdown in China, and it showed just elevated levels of depression and anxiety. Here in the US over the last year, hospitals are just reporting a rise in admissions for several children due to abuse and injuries and even deaths. So my point here is that no adult, no child has escaped really unscathed, or very few of them have escaped unscathed. Even those in the most fortunate of situations are going through what's called an adverse childhood experience, or an ACE. And this is a term that researchers use for a traumatic event in a child's life. And this is happening across all lines of class and race and geography, in the most affluent schools, the most impoverished ones, rural, urban, you name it. All of us are trying to figure out, how do we help young people who have experienced major educational and emotional setback? And this was always critical, but I think now we're facing it in a new way and a new level of understanding of the traumas that have taken place. And so this is a moment in time where real lasting change can happen if we have, this is the big if, I'm going to underline it, highlight it, if we have equity at the center of our work. That is key. Since leaving Chicago Public Schools, I actually started a philanthropic organization called Chicago Beyond. This is back in 2016. Like Steve mentioned, we're an impact investor and have done a ton of work here in Chicago. And part of what we've done is invest in partnerships. And so we have a unique partnership that I'll share with you with Chicago Public Schools. And I think it's relevant here, so that's why I'm bringing it up. Where we're really focused with Chicago Public Schools on building and thinking about what a healing center district might look like. This is pre-pandemic, but just from having been at Finger all those years, Finger High School all those years, and seeing all the needs of students and teachers and staff across the city, we knew that there could be more that could be done to address trauma in actual real time. So this past March, alongside Chicago Public Schools, we launched what we're calling the Healing Centered Framework. And it's really the first of its kind blueprint in the country. It's pretty amazing. And it's about holistic trauma support for 350,000 students in Chicago Public Schools. It's about reducing harm for our young people. And truly, it's a full circle moment for me, because a lot of what I learned at Finger shows up in that framework. The framework takes this comprehensive approach to healing and focuses on the wellness of students and the wellness of the adults, the staff, the family, the caregivers. And it's also trauma informed, meaning not only do we understand and become aware of trauma, but we also proactively promote collective healing as a whole school system, while we're responsibly and meeting the individual wellness needs of each student. And it's culturally responsive. It's about centering equity and promoting this liberatory consciousness, if you will, which I believe, these are, key and critical keys to success for all students, regardless of their zip code, regardless of, what side of the tracks they're on. But before, as I think about, your city, I think about our city, I think about our nation, there's a couple of key things I'll say. Before we start the next school year, we have to, as citizens, we need to push, people in our own communities to take a fresh look at how we support the emotional needs of our kids, so that we can essentially push a reset button in order to do things better in more holistic ways for our young people. This is what we did at Finger, when we dug in deep in order to address the trauma in our kids' lives. And it was the crucial thing that made it happen to having, all the voices at the table. But the difference maker was the orientation. It was the shift of the adults inside the building. Sometimes we look at schools that are failing, that don't have the outcomes we want them to have. And we, point the finger at the kids or the families or whatever the thing is. There's always a thing, right? But the difference maker for us at Fenger to get to those results that you saw on your screen was truly the orientation shift of the adults inside of the building. It was not a zero-sum game, We all lost if our young people's needs were not met. So as it relates to education, I'll say three things here that, we have to root ourselves in equity. We have to root ourselves in equity. And to do that, we must do these three things. So I'll give you a second to grab your pens and papers. This is good. We have to recognize our own assumptions and question our own bias and ask ourselves, am I getting in the way of true change or impact for, the students who exist in my school district or your school if you're a teacher, whatever it is. But, how is my bias? How are my assumptions getting in the way of change? We're in a huge period of change right now in our country. The second thing is, really meeting students where they are. We have to recognize that trauma takes on all different forms and that, each student's needs are different from the next. And so if we recognize that, we have to show up in ways that are, again, more human, more connected, more relational, looking at students as individuals as opposed to grouping everyone in one lump, category together. And the third thing I think we have to do, especially in this moment, this is particularly for my educators, but really it's for all of us, is we have to take care of ourselves. I firmly believe we are no good as parents, as grandparents, as school board members, as teachers, as principals, as staff members, as citizens, really, if we're not taking care of ourselves. And our own mental health and well-being. And so, this is how we need to support our young people, as if there is absolutely no other option but their success. And whether you're a school board member or a teacher or a parent or just a concerned citizen, if you truly believe in creating more equitable spaces for young people, that fully address their social and emotional needs, you have to show up differently. You will have to make different decisions. And you will have to ensure that everyone, including our kids, that they're able to win. So thank you so much again for having me here tonight. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I'm excited to dive into some Q&A for the next 20 minutes or so.
Thank you, Liz. That was great. Sorry again, everybody, for the technical difficulties at the start, but we do have some good audience questions here. I want to start with this one, Liz, because it's close to my heart. What role do you see for public libraries in creating these safe spaces, especially after school hours for students?
I think public libraries are absolutely essential. I mean, I saw while I was a principal at Fenger High School, kids needing spaces and places to go that were safe, public spaces and places to go that were safe. And our library, both the internal library to the school, but also our public library became respites, for safety, for kids just to participate in programming, to, check out books, do their thing, to gather and congregate, even though the librarians sometimes be a little bit upset that they were, making probably too much noise. But it provided those safe spaces. As I think even about, Chicago and what Chicago is doing with libraries in terms of like the homeless population. And, it's libraries are central to creating safe spaces in our communities overall.
Going to combine two questions here. So the last just over a year there's been a lot of opportunities for trauma. Obviously, the pandemic hits. The George Floyd murder was traumatic on an all other level for a lot of students. How do you assess the impact that this year had in particular on students' learning?
2020 and 2021, the combination?
Yes, the last year.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm a teacher, and I'm a principal at heart. So I run Chicago Beyond. Obviously, it's my passion. It's an organization that I started after leaving Fenger. But I am like one step away from schools and teachers and principals. It's where my heartbeat is. It's where a lot of my friends still do their best work. And as I think about some of the stories that they've shared, both from a psychological perspective, but also an academic perspective, it has been extremely impactful. One of my dear friends has an elementary school here in Chicago, and was describing to me that some of the challenges that she's facing in terms of like even just basic like learning for kids. And so here in Chicago, every child, if they wanted one, got a computer, they got internet access, like all the things. You think, okay, here's this toolkit, you get all these things. And it was interesting in that, what she discovered, shortly after all this technology was given is that, there were certain kids that didn't want to come on camera. They didn't want their background to be seen. They didn't want, there were just a variety of things that were happening inside young people's homes that, didn't allow them to even engage in the basics of online learning. I think there's huge, ramifications like academically. But also when I think of psychologically and social emotionally, a lot of, kids, school is a bit of a respite. It's like this, it can be this safe space where they can go to just breathe if the school is healthy and, doing what it's supposed to do. But, that was essentially taken away, and there were kids that were trapped in their homes. And so I don't really believe that we will truly understand the psychological implications and the academic implications until years to come, but they are definitely there. And that's why it's so important as we think about, we're transitioning into summer. We're going to hit the new school year in a few months. Like, what are we each doing in our own school communities to recognize not just the academic loss, but to really lean into this mental health and wellness for young people across the board? And I think, there are some, easy things that we can do around that to really help kids transition and to just recognize the trauma. It's not just the adult trauma, it's the children's trauma too.
Somebody asked particularly about lead paint, but I'll broaden that and ask, there are a host of issues that might be rooted in financial conditions, whether it's lead paint or asbestos or not getting 3 healthy meals a day. How do schools address those types of trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a hard question, but and this is more of just my personal perspective, and I'll just, throw that on the table. This is not speaking for Chicago Beyond or any other entity, but I really believe that, we have to make a more significant investment, not just in our schools, but in our communities overall. And that's just like full stop from my perspective, right? Like schools don't exist on some island. It's not like, the schools over there, like 10 miles down, like the rest of the, stuff is over here. Like schools exist at the very center. They are the very heartbeat of communities. And when we think about some of the things that I think the audience member was getting at, whether it's like lead paint or access to, proper textbooks and materials or access to whatever the thing is, like we have to take a look about, we have to take a deep look about how we invest in communities and how we essentially set them up for success. Like a school can, it is very hard to completely disinvest in a community and to see, for example, at Fenger, we had at one point in time in the area like a unemployment rate in the double digits. I want to say 20 or 30%. There were, every other home, boarded up. Like we can't have those type of environments, and somehow the school is not going to suffer the consequences of that. They exist in parallel and in tandem. And so we have to begin, as cities, as communities, to really take a look at how we're investing overall in our communities and in people.
We have somebody asking, to what extent has the trauma-informed approach been embraced kind of nationwide?
That's a great question. So when I started this work, it was in 2009. And I'd say my own personal internal shift came about maybe 2010, 2011, where I realized, okay, wait a minute, like it's not what's wrong with the kids, it's what's happened to the kids. And this is not about them doing differently. It's about us as adults showing up differently in how we approach them. And, at that time, 2010, 2011, we're talking about like a decade ago. Definitely, people were talking about trauma-informed care, but it wasn't as, I would say, widely and well received as it is now. And I really believe that that has a lot to do, honestly, with the events of the last 18, roughly or so months. I think we've all had a personal experience. I know I have, with, the isolation of COVID, of, the events of 2020 in terms of the racial reckoning. There's all these things that we're grappling with. And I think each in our own ways we've all experienced our own personal trauma. And as a result of that, I've been seeing, in broader society, but also particularly to schools, a much more keen focus in on, how do we provide, supports for our young people, even in the virtual environment? What does that look like? And so I will say that, again, in the last decade, there's definitely been shifts, but I think with this kind of nice, healthy pace and the pandemic hit, I think people's understanding and receptivity to it the slope has really improved, which is good. It should have always been that way, So oftentimes with kids, we sometimes look at schools and we think about test scores and we think about, all these like kind of, these metrics that don't really get to the humanness of it. Like we're raising little humans, like we're raising like critical thinkers and problem solvers, and we're trying to raise curious people. And in order for those children to show up in that way, they have to be healthy, just like we do as adults. We can't show up on our jobs and we're just like completely like falling apart. So kids are no different.
So somebody asked about the cost, and I found that to be an interesting question because we're not talking about sexy things like buildings here. How are schools getting these projects funded?
Yeah, so I'll speak to two things. I'll give an example from Fenger, and I'll give the current example of which I touched on inside of my chat with the group here, which was Chicago Public Schools. So with the Fenger High School, this is again 10 years ago when we first started this work, we actually got a federal grant. It was called a SIG grant, a school improvement grant, and it was good for 4 years. And every year it roughly gave us an additional $1 million. And that sounds like a lot of money when you think, oh my God, $1 million is so much money. But it's really not a lot of money when it comes to schools. It's really not. That was not even 10% of what the school's budget actually was, not even 10%. But it did allow us the flexibility to do some of the things that I talked about, in our chat, which, was everything from, additional counselors to additional training for staff, reading classes. I'd even get into like the reading and how we had, 40% of our young people coming in reading at a second or third grade reading level into ninth grade. Coming into ninth grade, second or third grade reading level or below, or non-readers, but it allowed us to, have reading classes and the things that just help kids be successful in that environment. That was particular to Fenger. I was there for 6 years, had the grant my first 4, not the last 2. And I'll tell you, it made things a lot more difficult, like just a lot more difficult. Resources matter. They matter most when they're used, effectively and efficiently, but, resources do matter. As I think about in a larger context, I think about Chicago Public Schools, the third largest school district in the country, serving 350,000 young people across our city. We work with Chicago Public Schools to develop that healing-centered framework that I mentioned, and part of that, which we were just thrilled about was that Chicago Public Schools, even in the midst of this incredible crisis that they're facing with like budgets and all the things, dedicated $25 million to helping to bring that healing-centered framework to life. And so I say all that to say that, all of this comes at a cost, a financial cost and other costs. But really, I would push us to think about what is the true cost. Because when we don't invest in things around, students healing and them being like healthy and whole individuals, there are costs on the back end, in terms of students' life outcomes, in terms of a society, in terms of like, people becoming incarcerated and going down all these different paths. And so I think it's the most, effective and efficient way to use resources is to, when we think about, again, healing resources, social emotional support, because again, we're not building cogs in a wheel. We are building, human beings who are going to be curious and supported and loved and cared for in ways that are just essential.
Really like this question. If we're trying to press reset on the way we meet students, how effective do you think it would be if more educators were trained to work with students in public digital spaces?
Can you say the question one more time, Stephen?
How effective do you think it would be if more educators were trained to work with students inside of public digital spaces? So meeting the kids where they are, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's actually really important. One of the projects that Chicago Beyond, which is the organization I founded and work for now, supported recently was an organization called LEAP. It's here in Chicago, but really has a national footprint as well. It was highlighted by the Gates Foundation and a variety of ways. You can look it up if you're interested. If it's called LEAP, L-E-A-P. And part of why we made this investment in what they're doing is because it's exactly that. I do believe we need to make investments in different technologies to help with learning. I mean, I think gone are the days of just like the sit and get, like those that passed us like decades ago. But oftentimes, especially in environments where the socioeconomic status of students is limited, we often see this kind of harkening back to those kind of old ways of being, and we're not preparing our kids to function in like current society, let alone the future. And so I think there are investments that we need to make, but it can't just be piecemealed. I love LEAP and I love the work that they do, but they are, one entity that exists. It really needs to take place on a larger level in terms of, again, like, government, and how are we investing in all of those things that help move us into, the next level of our educational system. And that requires, which, I think goes back to this larger thing of like, we all have a role to play, who we put in office and how people vote and how they, how much we value, education overall.
Somebody mentioned, actually our library comments moderator mentioned that this sounds kind of like what Arne Duncan talked about when he was Secretary of Education. How effective do you think he was in implementing some of what you're talking about?
That's a great question. So Arne Duncan, for those of you who don't know, was former Secretary of Education. When Barack Obama was elected, Arne was the CEO of Chicago Public Schools, and the president actually picked him to lead the Department of Education. And he did so for, I think it was roughly like 7 years. Arne, I think, attempted to, with a lot of Common Core and a lot of other, I think, programs and projects he was piloting, tried in his best ways to create an equitable education system. I think that, no one person, I don't care what your role is, like no one person can fundamentally transform the entire United States educational system, no matter how good you think you are. It's not happening, right? I mean, there's states' rights and all these different things. But I think the important point is I think about, his time in office, and I think about really the moment that we're in now, is that we've got to try and do more. We have got to do something. We've got to prioritize our children. And I look at, I just, from a personal standpoint, feel that, people show what they value by their time and their money, period, full stop. Personally, professionally, that's in my mind, how we show value is through time and money. And when I look at, where education spending exists, in states, and where, how much time we think of, whether it's with our politicians or whoever, how much time we can spend talking about education, it's clear that education really isn't valued to the level that it needs to be. And as a result, there are ramifications that I think are going to be long and far reaching into the future for us as a country, and for our children, obviously.
I like this question as well. How do you find that long-term, maybe old guard teachers accept this approach?
I hate to bucket people into like, old guard, new guard, like and put people in these, I think that promotes otherizing. So I wouldn't necessarily use that terminology, but I will say that I think for all of us, it's a shift, my friend that I mentioned earlier, who has an elementary school here on the south side of Chicago, and she had a range of teachers with a range of ages and a range of experience in education, and when they went into remote learning, everyone was trying to scramble to figure some things out. It's not like you can just sit on a Zoom and talk to 7-year-olds for 8 hours. There's all types of technology that needs to be deployed. But I think it is worth it for us in the education field to be investing in professional development for teachers. As I think about, education, buckets and where money goes, professional development for teachers is absolutely critical in technology and in everything we're talking about tonight. Social emotional development, understanding the cultural context of students, working in teams together and how to do that. Like all of those things, I think really matter, and we have to invest in our teachers too, which is one of the reasons why I'm actually really proud of the healing-centered framework that we developed with Chicago Public Schools. Chicago Beyond and Chicago Public Schools, when we partnered, made sure to center that healing-centered framework, not just on the young people. It's not just about the kids, it's about the adults in the building and the staff, the teachers, the people who sit in the front office. Like, how are each of those adults healthy and whole? And I think the same is true, obviously, this is in a social emotional context. We're talking about with a healing framework. But I think it's also true with professional development. Like, how are we really focusing on our teachers and really helping them develop in this ever-changing, ever-moving, fast-paced world in which we live?
I'm going to combine two more here to kind of wrap up, I think. This shouldn't be a political issue, but it seems like sometimes it becomes a political issue. It gets lumped into kind of this snowflake debate. And I wonder if you can make the case for why that's not what we're talking about.
And can you tell me what the snowflake debate is? Because I have no idea.
I think that there is a movement within one of the parties in America that perhaps the other party has become too soft and their feelings get hurt too easily, and we worry too much about that. And I feel like that's kind of a perversion of what you're talking about, but I wonder if you can make the case for why those aren't necessarily the same thing. We're not protecting feelings, we're talking about real trauma.
Yeah, I guess I would push us to think about the pandemic, and push us not into the current moment of the pandemic, but to push us back to like March and April of like 2020, and to think about, our own feelings and our own like separation anxiety and isolation and what that did to us individually. And then just think about that little slice of that, what that was like for each of us. And now imagine, some of the communities that we're talking about, where we're not just talking about, just like isolation, we're talking about, the trauma of environments, of, all the things that I was talking about earlier in the talk, like, the complex nature of violence and the harm that, both witnessing and experiencing what it does to the mind and what it does to the body, and the very real effect. It's not, the stuff I'm saying is not like made up. There's actually like, research behind like what trauma literally physiologically does to our cells and how it embeds within, and like it prevents like oftentimes like learning and comprehension and all those things. And so I guess I would push people who say that it's we're being too soft, to really read up on some of the effects of trauma, but B, realize that the fate of our country really depends on this. It just does. Like, we cannot expect children to show up and engage in education in real ways unless we're addressing these issues. And if you look at some of the best schools in the country, and I had the fortune the good fortune of, traveling around the country, speaking to different school districts and teachers. And I've been at literally some of the top schools in the country, elementary and high school and universities. And I've also been the ones that are most challenged, where I spent a lot of my time as a teacher and a principal. Some of the best schools, all those psychological safety nets I was talking about, those are embedded into the school, and so we just have to think about, that's why equity is so important. We have to think about, not just like the best schools get this type of support and resource, but like all schools do, because the reality is, we're all in this together. Like as a country, like we rise and fall together, and that's just a fact.
That's actually a great transition to this last question here. New president in the White House, new administration. Where do you see us going in the next 4 years?
Well, I'm hopeful. We'll say that. I'm hopeful. I think, just honestly speaking, I think there's a lot of good things in play, but it remains to be seen. It's not, because I just believe it's not dependent on any one political figure. Just like I mentioned the thing with Arne and, it's not about any one person, any one administration. Like we're not going to shift education in anyone's 4-year term or 8-year term. We really have to be in this for the long haul. And I think that requires us not to look at the current president and say, all the things about that president, but like, how are we as voters, locally in our own school districts, our own school systems, like how are we voting people onto our school boards and as our school principals, and ensuring our teachers are the best. It's we can sometimes take this up to be a very like large macro thing, and it is. But it's also very localized. And I think it's so important that, we remember that, this is local, and that there are real things that each of us can do within our own school system, within our own schools, to make and create a more equitable environment, to focus on trauma and healing. And let me tell you, we can do those things at a much faster pace than we can change the entire national education system. So that's what I'll say on that.
But, well, Liz, thank you very much. That was great. You have anything you would like to share with us in closing?
Just to really encourage people. I think we're in an incredible moment in history in our country, and our children, the fate of our children is really dependent on each person on this Zoom and webinar tonight. And so just take that responsibility seriously. And I wish everyone all the best. And thank you again for having me, Stephen. This has really been wonderful.
Thank you very much for joining us. Good night, everybody.
Good night.